simple practices like a 2 or 3 bullet recap from a meeting can be extremely effective because you're training your brain to process information on a daily basis, and it really actually builds your knowledge bank and it builds you as a professional and a thought leader.
You're listening to The Successful Bookkeeper with your host, Michael Palmer. Listen each week as inspiring guests share their secrets of success to help you increase your confidence, work smarter, and build a business you love. This episode of The Successful Bookkeeper is brought to you by PureBookkeeping.com, the proven system to grow your bookkeeping business.
Welcome back to the Successful Bookkeeper Podcast. I am your host, Michael Palmer, and today's show is going to be a fantastic one. Our guest is a documentation and productivity expert who is the director of Risk Oversight and the author of the new book, The 24-Hour Rule and Other Secrets for Smarter Organizations, including the 6 Steps of Dynamic Documentation. Adrienne Bellehumeur, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's great to have you, and a really interesting and exciting topic. And Adrienne, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about you and your career journey that's led you up to this point.
Sure. Well, it's not the most exciting story. I'll warn you with that. I became a chartered accountant after school because I needed a job and worked as a chartered accountant and in the corporate world for a few years. But actually, after having a job, I realized, having a job is not what I really wanted. So at the age of 26, I started consulting for myself, and consulting might be a bit generous. I worked a bunch of odd gigs in business analysis, accounting, and whatnot, often with friends and family. I met my husband a few years later, who owned a firm he had started after the Enron SOX days. And so companies were all scrounging to get more internal control processes and compliance programs in. And I started working with him part-time, and we eventually got married, and I also took over the company as well. So that's where I am today. I currently run Risk Oversight, and we are a leading firm in internal controls compliance. And over those years, I've had a huge fascination with documentation best practices and have been speaking and writing about it for many years because it underpins so many aspects of my business and even your personal life as well.
Very cool. Well, I think it's a very interesting background. And, it's always interesting how people end up doing the things that they do. And when we're talking about documentation, like how does somebody get into that or that be their thing, right? So really cool. And so now you've been doing that. How did you discover the hidden power of documentation?
Well, it wasn't really one eureka moment. I'd say it's actually 3 things. First of all, in school, while most kids were into Guns N' Roses, I actually had a nerdy fascination with notes from a pretty young age and would actually remember looking out in class and wondering, are people actually taking notes and how is this impacting their work? I also actually have distinct memories in my early days in the workforce. I worked actually for the large Canadian banks in Toronto, and I also articled in the CA profession. And I do remember there was an assumption that everyone understood documentation, that we were sort of expected to know that the best practices from birth. But I actually thought that was a false assumption. I still think that today. And then as I grew into my bigger consulting roles over the years, starting quite humbly, but growing up, I really noticed so many instances where documentation is such a make or break on projects. I remember watching consultants walk out of clients, but nothing was written down, and companies wasting millions of dollars. I've seen meetings that are a complete repeat of last week's meeting because of failure to write things down. And the other thing I started noticing over the years, that although I might label myself with a slightly different title, like a business analyst or a project manager, or a SOX expert or an internal control expert, it's always the fundamentals of this underpinning practice of documentation is really what you do. It really is the basis of so much at work, but we tend to give it different titles and certainly sexier terms. But I like to call it out as what it is as part of my work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, the cost of not documenting or writing things down as simply as put. And it, when you say it like you have, it is incredibly costly. And I can think of meetings I've had where nobody wrote anything down. And it was, I've been there, I've lived some of those things. And you can always tell a project where it's like fully documented, kind of figured out, this is what we're doing. And as you go along, the more you it just goes better. It's more fun, and you come up with a better product at the other end of it. Why is it that people don't document things in their life?
Well, first of all, we have a optimism bias where we actually believe we will remember things. And this is when we are in the moment listening, you're listening to me right now, you actually think you will remember what I'm saying, but we actually don't. So that is one dimension of the problem. Another dimension is knowledge is power, and people do covet knowledge in organizations. Unfortunately, I will say that I've seen that in my travels. And the third, which I think is actually the saddest, is that people are embarrassed, or how do I put this? Really, one of our most deepest human fears is the fear of looking stupid. And people don't write enough down. They don't clarify what was said. They don't clarify how they're thinking through something. They don't clarify an accounting entry. We can definitely applies in our bookkeeping accounting world as well, out of the fear of looking bad, because writing things down really does put it in the open for anyone to criticize. But certainly I would say, if you're never really wrong, you're never really right either. You need to put things down to get clarity, to actually move work forward, and to make things happen.
It really is the cat chasing the tail. I don't want to seem like I'm wrong, but then you're going to be wrong because you get the bias. You're not going to remember it. So it's just this recycling or cyclical, if I'm saying that correctly here, problem. And so this is rampant everywhere, I'm guessing. And then I would ask around the notes, like my experience of taking notes throughout my lifetime has been can be overwhelming, like being able to take what is the core points while you're listening to somebody and being present with somebody else, and taking the core points and being able to get those notes, the important bits, without the whole transcript. Like you go from, okay, here's a transcript of everything everybody said, but what are the key messages? For me, that's always been a problem. And in fact, in the podcast, I never take notes in the podcast. For me to listen, and actually, if I was writing something down, I wouldn't be listening to what you're saying. So we actually do the notes after the podcast. But I'm really curious your take on that.
Well, I'd say one of my advice for people, as in general, we don't take enough notes. And I'm not a believer in copious notes, but simple practices like a 2 or 3 bullet recap from a meeting can be extremely effective, because you're training your brain to process information on a daily basis. And it really actually builds your knowledge bank, and it builds you as a professional and a thought leader. So as a very simple, low-hanging fruit, start taking 2 or 3. Not most meetings we go to, unlike podcasts, are not recorded. We just need that discipline as part of our daily practices. And I don't have one tool a lot of people say, well, what's your magic tool to give? I use a lot of different tools, but can't overcome these very simple human practices if you want to get better at documentation and thinking in general.
That's right. The problem is in this scenario is definitely me, because it's going in my ear and it's got to come out somewhere. So it's either my hand either types it or writes it with a pen, but there's no tool to sort of insert in my brain yet.
There's no tool that can tell you, and I'm sure you have so many great guests that you probably have 2 or 3 things that were the golden nuggets from each podcast. Those can be actually very valuable over time. They do accumulate. Yeah.
Yes. No, absolutely. And I think it's a practice that, from a simple perspective, and I like how you've put that. It's like if our listener, and including myself here, is we're taking the 3, like, what are the 3 things? If we can't have 3, well, it's going to be probably more than just 1. So 3 is a great number, and so useful to summarize a meeting with clients, with your team members, even with your family, to have that documented. And that's a nice, easy goal for everyone to achieve, and begin that journey of like, oh, well, what did we talk about? Well, these were the 3 points that we talked about. And then I'd imagine there's some sort of human thing that unlocks other memories or something with those small notes.
Absolutely. You nailed it. So I'm excited that you're going to practice these 2 rules.
Yes, well, we'll get there. I got to get some more tools. I'm hoping that, but it is interesting that you say that about, like, there are softwares out there now that claim, oh, we can summarize your notes for you, or summarize a call using AI. And I'm not saying that it won't happen, but everything I've experienced, it's still the human brain is a pretty powerful thing to be able to work on these sorts of problems. But eventually there will maybe be a magical tool that it'll say, hey, this is what you need to remember out of this meeting. Let the computers do all the work for us.
I think we're a long way off. I think Elon Musk is working on it. But for us to take 60 minutes of a meeting or a transcript and dissect it into a couple notes, I mean, that's what the brain does well. And we're actually all filtering for our own lens on the world. So I'm a little skeptical we're gonna
exactly.
that AI will replace.
Right now it's all just marketing promises that aren't too effective. It's pretty much just giving you transcripts of things, maybe some key highlights. It is actually interesting to see it in play, but for sure we can get there quite far with our magical, amazing human brain, which is what you're recommending. So we've maybe touched on this a little bit, but what is the most efficient and effective ways of documentation in your experience that our listener could implement? Is it taking the notes throughout the meeting? Is it listening to, when you can, listen to a recording? Any superpower tips there that we would be able to share with our listener?
In general, the most effective way of taking notes, or just even notes, can be a very broad. I could spend 30 minutes just talking about the definition of notes, because it actually is pretty broad. But the main low-hanging fruit that your listener can apply is just to practice taking 1 or 2 notes a day. And it doesn't necessarily have to be from a meeting. It could actually be an idea. It could be you go to a conference, you get a new prospect come by. That the point is that you're seizing opportunity and pulling it into your documentation system where you can, or also leveraging the information in your brain. I mean, your listeners, a lot of them are successful bookkeepers, successful accountants, and sometimes we have a hesitancy to actually put as much in writing as we should. And even if you're not looking to be the next Brené Brown or Malcolm Gladwell, the practice of writing just to think things out, either through notes, journaling, thinking through ideas at work, thinking through how you're going to expand your business, how you're going to solve a client's problem, is extremely effective. Again, I'm giving very low-tech advice that what you can do to improve your notes and documentation pretty immediately is really just to practice. And that can be as simple as 1 or 2 notes a day that addresses problems you're working on.
Love it. Absolutely love it. And that's the best place to start, is the low-tech solution. So with that example, we've had a meeting, we've taken some notes, or we have some ideas, we have some notes. How do we start to move this from, okay, we have some notes to actual documentation? Because that seems to be like when I hear the title, the 6 steps of dynamic documentation, I think I love the idea of there being steps to actually going. And I would imagine that we have ideas and plans and meetings and whatnot that we've then taken these. How do we move that into something that, like, it's almost information management?
Yeah. So my approach to documentation is I view it as problem solving. This is kind of a strange take. A lot of people view documentation as very administrative. To me, when I look at my clients, whether they're in the process of going public or they're wrestling with a transformation initiative, or they're stuck in a vortex of meetings, or they have information locked in people's heads that they can't get out, they all actually are believe it or not, very similar problems, all solved by 6 steps of documentation, which are capturing information, which is about getting things on paper. Structuring is about doing something. Communicating, presenting information, which is about how you show it. Store and leveraging, and leading and innovating through this information. So I always work through these very similar steps, and there's skills and disciplines along the way. So back to your question about how we take notes and actually move them into something of value, it's actually often starting kind of using those steps. You're capturing information in meetings, or even from your own head is actually a capturing source, or from systems. And then you have to have the techniques of structuring. That could be the ability to move things into templates, or to structure it into a way that in a system, or sets of documents, and then also make this information really engaging for readers. So again, I kind of work through in my book and in my own training with clients. It's always about kind of working through these 6 steps, starting with the basis of getting things on paper, and then getting better and better techniques and skills. I do believe documentation is a comprehensive set of skills for solving problems at hand, which can be a major range of problems, but they often have very similar techniques and skills to solve.
Absolutely. And we talk about it a lot on this podcast, is the documentation is often what's required in order for someone to, like, if we're talking about a standard operating procedure, the documentation required it needs to be quite in depth, because there's, like, in the world of bookkeeping and accounting, there are technical things that is being done, and it needs to be done a certain way. There's a lot of knowledge and information transfer that has to happen. And so that in itself can be overwhelming to people. Like, oh, in order for, I've done this, I've written this down, and somebody didn't get it right. So it must be the document, their problem, or it didn't actually do the job that we needed it to do. But it really was the beginning, the basis, I think, of making something that has to evolve. I like the word dynamic, because what you write down today, 2 minutes from now, likely will change, especially in the world that we live in today. What's been your experience with people and their resistance, I guess, to getting the documentation done and built in a way that actually is effective for people to use and utilize?
The resistance is, one challenge that I try to solve, to back to your excellent point on operating manuals, is we actually don't have great benchmarks or standards for documentation. We do have quite a few actually in the data world, but fewer for documentation. So I have developed my own set of standards. Can be as basic as reperformance, which we learn about a lot in the CPA profession, which means someone who picks up your document can actually reperform a task. There's other standards like clarity, or is the document being used? That addresses one part. I actually think we're not well trained in how to actually benchmark our documents, which leads to us developing subpar level of quality often. So that's one.
That would be, yeah, that makes sense. I love the metrics too. Like, did this document get looked at? How many times were they able to complete the work as per the document? That's interesting, because if people don't know how it's performing, that's going to impact whether people, is this stuff even working? That's like always going to be a question.
Mm-hmm. It is one of the disconnect in the documentation space. We don't have these consistent metrics. So that is one challenge. The other, I also use something I call the 5 stages of documentation, which is applied more to companies or teams, which is about showing, documents. It's almost like the capability maturity model that we learn about, but there's a little bit of a twist on it. My experience with clients is that they're either stage 1, which is just beginning, stage 2, which is a little bit, stage 3 is going through the motions. It's actually the most common. It means you probably have decent documents to satisfy your regulators, your accountants, or your lawyers, but you're not actually getting a lot of value. Stage 4 is about the ideal stage, which is where you're actually getting value from what you're doing. And stage 5 is overkill. I actually think this overkill stage is also equally part of the challenge. We don't acknowledge when we're overkilling what we're doing, and also when we're going through the motions. That's been my other challenge, looking at organizations and that lack of kind of benchmark or solid standards against.
It has me think that the at that stage, it could have another piece, which is, and I've seen this happen in the past, well, probably all the time still, is you've got something really well documented. People are actually using it, but they're actually now doing it the wrong way because things have changed. So it's like that upkeep and maintenance of the documentation, which it almost, if someone says, okay, this is the way we do it, but then there becomes a better way of doing it or a more efficient way of doing it, but that hasn't been documented, everybody just continues to do that. So it's like having this steward almost of the documentation to make sure, or have that be part of the culture to make sure that, hey, is this the best way? Can this be updated? Is it easy to update? Are we adding to it? Because you could be living in that overkill stage, but there's almost like a pre-stage, which is it's there, it's done, it's worked, but it hasn't been maintained.
Absolutely. That's another challenge. And hence the word, my method is called dynamic documentation. It's all about embracing change and being iterative and driving things forward at the same time.
I love that. So when it comes to the work that you do with your clients, what and we talk about these stages. We talked about documenting, just taking notes, and then moving these throughout the stages into a documentation system. Is there a way that people can organize these things? Because I imagine that's part of the challenge, is how do you organize all of that information so that it doesn't become a big clutter of information?
Sure. So the world of information management is certainly a hot topic nowadays because of the explosion of information. Now, this is not going to answer everything about how to organize, but in my work with clients on information management and policies, I would actually recommend staying as simple as possible. If you want things to be organized and to be able to be accessible, you focus on what are controlled documents. This is very basic. What do you want to control? Because organizations and people don't typically control everything. It's actually not possible. So what do I want to control? That's kind of the first question I'd recommend asking. What are my categories? So that's the buckets you put information in is also equally important to how you manage it. And thirdly is, where do we put it, or where are approved repositories? Now, I'm grossly simplifying the information management challenge, but focusing on kind of the 3 core areas there can get you a long way. And my experience is that actually companies stumble right out of the gate on these three very basic questions. But when you can resolve them, it does help you to making this information management piece more manageable.
Okay. And what are those?
So the three areas
Yes.
are what the controlled documents. So what do you want to control?
Control.
And what do you want to put attention on? Your categories. So how do I bucket my information? And thirdly, your approved repositories. So where do I put things? Really, it's just those questions, those three questions of what do I want to control, how do I bucket them, and where do I put them?
And where are they going to go?
It's so basic, but those are the most important to remember.
So true. And I would imagine for me anyways, thinking about it, the most important is like, where does it all go? If that's where I've messed up in the past in my own documentation, my own notes, it's that organization of where are they going to go? And it's I love the word dynamic that you use, because it has been over my lifetime is filing and putting information and trying to make it as efficient as possible so that I'm not searching for the documentation or information that I need. And that's why it's constantly a process of making it better and better. And the more I do it, the better I get at it. And it is really, really satisfying when a good piece of documentation has been built that someone else can take and actually just do the job and do it really well.
Absolutely. That's about getting leverage from your work. So that's
And
what I believe in.
That's it. That's the leverage part. And so many probably don't get there because they don't get through the full 6 steps or go through those stages and make sure that they have, what is it that they want to accomplish, or how are they going to structure it, and then where are they going to put it. Let's talk a little bit about your book, because we've talked about it already, but the 24-hour rule, what had you write the book?
Well, I wrote it because of some of the reasons I mentioned, that there is an assumption in the workplace that documentation is a skill, sort of like breathing, that everyone is good at it. But this assumption is actually incorrect. I do think we need to train our workforce, especially today's knowledge-based workforce, in some of these fundamental basic skills. So that was my core motivation, was just to get better training for the workforce and better recognition that this is an underpinning skill that will help you for your career. And it's also a skill that transcends industry and profession, and no matter what level you're at as well. In the past, we've actually trained people very much in silos in documentation. Accountants are trained one way, lawyers are trained another, engineers another, sales professional have their own systems. But my message was about getting this pervasive best practice that can apply to everyone, really.
And very interesting. And what is the 24-hour rule?
So the 24-hour rule is the personal side of information management. It's also the golden rule of documentation, and it's also your newest productivity hack, I say as well. So the rule is pretty simple. It's that you need to reprocess, rethink, or rewrite information within 24 hours of hearing it or thinking it, or in simpler terms, do something with information in 24 hours. It's very much based on the science of the human brain. We like to think of ourselves as conscientious planners, but humans actually have a huge optimism bias where we don't remember things very well. We only have slots for 7 Post-it notes. If you think of the short-term memory bank, it's literally like having Post-it notes pasted on our head. And in a short span of about 24 to 48 hours, these Post-it notes literally stop dropping. So if we want to improve our documentation practices, we actually have to act on information while it is available and while it's fresh to us. And acting on information in 24 hours is really a game changer when it comes to productivity, because you're taking information when it's fresh and when we have momentum behind it and pulling it into your personal practices. And a lot of this came from my frustration with watching meetings and never getting actioned, but to my bookkeeper accounting professionals as well, there's actually huge implications as well. I mean, just retaining receipts or documenting the reason for journal entries. Your best bet of getting things done is always within that window, and training people to tap into information while it is at its optimal point or the freshest in the brain is the best for you and best for your documentation and best for organizations overall, actually, if everyone is practicing this very, very simple rule.
Very cool. And I love that idea. It's just acting upon it within 24 hours. And you're absolutely right. Otherwise, it just becomes a stack of information that is useless, and the value is lost. And you outlined a lot of those, whether it's in a sales meeting or client interaction or a meeting. That time is valuable. And if it's not actioned upon, it's completely under leveraged.
Absolutely. And we also want to act while we have momentum at our back. I mean, maybe you're perfect, but you probably have something on your to-do list that has just sat there for the last 2 weeks or so. And then you probably had something else that you did immediately that came in just this morning. We're actually very good at actioning in that window, and we're at our most productive. It's really about our relationship with information. But the longer you wait, it takes more momentum to actually do. So there's some science and productivity behind this rule as well. It's just being good for your documentation.
Absolutely. And I'm far from perfect. I talk about that all the time on the podcast. I don't have it all figured out. But one of the things is, for me, is constant improvement, right? To take in, this is one area that I really enjoy, because I know that payoff is when it's done correctly, when documentation gets done correctly. If I've taken notes and I've done a follow-up email to someone or taken action with it, put it where it needs to go, move the ball out of my court per se, it's satisfying. And and things happen and we get results, and that's what we're up to, right? Is trying to do the best that we can every day. And so it's really a great conversation, refreshing one. In fact, is that when we get all of this information out of our head onto paper in some form of documentation, get it in the hands of other people, it's very powerful. We can accomplish so much more.
Absolutely.
And it's a lot less stressful. We can sleep at night because it's not rattling around somewhere in our unconscious mind. And I really love this conversation of the what we keep calling it, the bias. What was it again?
Our optimism bias with our short-term memory. Yes,
optimism bias around short-term memory. That is just so true. And and it's tough because it's a human condition. Mm-hmm. So even right now, we're gonna still, even though we know that we have it, we're still going to do it. So
yes.
We have to put these little hacks and use these things so that we can be smarter and have smarter and build and work within smarter organization, as you say in the title of your book. Adrienne, this has been fantastic. Where can people find out more about you and your books and perhaps more of the learning that you have available?
Well, I'm active on LinkedIn, so I'd love to connect with any of your listeners, and please contact me if you have any questions about documentation or anything else I can help you with. For more information on documentation and workflow, you can visit my website, my personal website at bellehumorco.com. And I have information on the book there, and also some information on some special promotions I'm doing. I'm doing speaking and training and documentation advisory in exchange for bulk pre-orders for the book for interested organizations. And my firm is riskoversight.ca. That's where you can go for more information on excellent internal control programs, specifically in accounting and governance related work. So thank you so much for that.
It's been beautiful. It's been such a fun and refreshing conversation. And on behalf of our listeners, I want to thank you for sharing your expertise and your wisdom with us today.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
And the pleasure has been all ours. And with that, we wrap another episode of the Successful Bookkeeper podcast. To learn more about today's wonderful guest and to get access to all sorts of valuable free business building resources, you can go to thesuccessfulbookkeeper.com. Until next time, goodbye.
You've been listening to The Successful Bookkeeper with Michael Palmer. For more information and to download the resources mentioned in this episode, please visit us at thesuccessfulbookkeeper.com. Thank you for listening.